Just because it's a cartoon, again, doesn't mean it's not violent.
We do violence in games because it's easy.
We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace.
Your nation says go to Germany and kill Nazis, you do. Your nation says kill cops, and you do. The video games are the trainers.
Video games get into trouble when they're both highly realistic and when they have an ethical
children
system
kind of one
that
model
is
as they're growing
highly
up,
different.
which is shoot everything in sight and blow it up, and it's you
Healthy
against the
people
world,
have
and
to
you're
be
the good
trained to
guy,
go
and everything that
in the
comes at you
video
is bad
game
guys
Easy
shoot them
today
before
for
they kill
troubled
them.
youth to surround themselves with a culture
Well, they have
that
been
celebrates
in their simulators.
violence.
The gangbangers played Grand Theft Auto since they were 5 years old.
Absolutely.
Every experiment, every behavior that would get you some
Violence
going
has been going down since the early 90s. The correlation actually doesn't
Whether
fit.
it's constitutional or not constitutional, maybe as a society we have to
They're
talk about
mass
what
murder
numbing
simulators.
ourselves to
Nobody
this
ever-
That's why we all
very
pretend
graphic
insanely
violence. It's not
that
like
there's
a
nothing
cartoon.
wrong
This
with or
looks like a
disturbing
real
about a
person's
child
head
spending
exploding.
all
We
day
must stop
killing
or
people.
substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately.
May 31st, 2014. Two girls, Anissa Wire and Morgan Geyser, went to a local park in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and lured their friend, Peyton Luther, with the intention of killing her. They stabbed her 19 times and walked out of the park. Peyton was found later by a cyclist and miraculously survived. Later, the police caught Anissa and Morgan, but instead of trying to escape or plead not guilty, they were calm and collected. Their defense? Slenderman made them do it, or he would kill their family. Slenderman was originally a Photoshop monster turned creepypasta turned video game monster that, after this incident, parents got worried about their children's safety, and since this was during the time that he was a popular video game character, parents started to blame video games for the violent act. But are video games to blame here? From other accounts in court, the girls were crazy, but could the video games have sparked this heinous act? Well, let's look at the facts. Now, there's no denying that video games can have a ton of violence, but why? Why do they have violence? According to Ben Knight, a media and content coordinator at the University of New South Wales, the reason why video games have violence is because they fill out a psychological need and helps us better understand ourselves. Knight claims that the psychological needs are a sense of control, feeling connected with others, and success, and that these types of video games help immensely with those needs, whether that's upgrading your weapons, playing with friends, or doing missions. Knight also claims that they allow players to experience situations that we most likely won't encounter in a safe environment, claiming that they actually help manage aggressive behavior. But is there any evidence backing up this claim? Do violent video games really suppress anger, or do they cause violence? According to Gabardin Alessandro, an associate professor at the University of Milan who specializes in psychology, claims that violent video games lack empathy towards characters, an example being Grand Theft Auto, and how they treat women characters in the game, acting more like sex objects instead of people. Alessandro continues his argument, claiming that violent video games are hyper-masculine and treat men with power. He then does an experiment where people would play a mild violent video game and a hyper-violent game and see how different they reacted. He claims that the results showed that the more violent and masculine the game was, the less empathy they had towards other characters, especially female characters. Additionally, Carolyn Phillips, an associate professor at the University of Texas, claims that violent video games have a negative effect on children, most notably aggression. Physical violence, explosive tempers, fighting, and destruction are common and could start as early as elementary school. She then goes into detail of what can be done to prevent this behavior, mostly about limiting screen time, looking at the game contents, and looking at the rating before handing it over to a child. On the flip side, Christopher Engelhardt, the co-founder of Velocity Data Tech, did an experiment where he would have participants play in a non-violent video game and a violent video game while intersplicing images in between sessions. The results came out with mixed results. The most common result being that the test subjects became desensitized to violent images and video games. The mix being aggression. Some test subjects were more aggressive after their session than others, so Engelhardt claims that being desensitized to violent images could be a pathway to aggression, but more testing would be needed and doesn't have a big link between violence. Additionally, Brian Vastag, a scientific reporter at the Washington Post, reports that violence within youth has decreased as sales for violent video games has risen. That's important because people like to claim that more and more kids are going to be violent due to the rise of video game sales. But Vastag says that this is not the case. He also goes into the history of why people have this stigma against video games, what parents can do, and how the states have handled this situation. David Zendel and Paul Carnes, a lecturer and professor, respectively, at the University of York, did an experiment where they would let test subjects play old violent video games and newer games to see if violence is caused by better graphics and gameplay. The results showed that higher fidelity graphics did not lead to more violence or aggression, and it actually even led to decreased aggression. This led to a different conclusion, that even if video games led to violence, graphics would have very little to do with it, which people use as an argument on why video games should be limited. Finally, Simone Kuhn, a professor who works in neuroscience, did an experiment where they would let test subjects play a non-violent game and have another play a violent one and see how they would react at the end of 2 months. The results found a short-term effect for one. The exposure to the violent video game saw an increase in aggressive thoughts and a decrease in helping behavior. However, it was very rare and the effects only lasted less than 15 minutes and could not be replicated. So, do video games cause violence? Well, it's complicated. There are results showing that video games don't cause violence at all and even gets rid of aggression. But there are also results showing that there are connections that can be linked to violence. Back to the Slenderman case. While Anissa and Morgan were both medically insane, could the video game have cemented their idea of what Slenderman could do and, in turn, cause the act of violence? Well, we can't be sure, and maybe we never will.